The wind howled like a wounded animal across the frozen peaks of Glacier National Park, visibility dropping to zero as Ranger Jake Sullivan fought through the worst blizzard in 20 years. His radio crackled with static, no rescue choppers flying tonight, no backup coming. When the faint glow of light flickered through the trees ahead, Jake knew something was wrong. The old Mackenzie cabin had been abandoned for decades. Jake's snowshoes crunched against the deep powder as he approached the weathered structure. The windows glowed amber against the white chaos, and thin smoke curled from the chimney before being instantly torn away by the savage wind. He'd patrolled these mountains for 3 years and had never seen so much as a camping light near this place. The locals avoided it, claiming old Tom Mackenzie's ghost still wandered the property. Drawing closer, Jake could make out a figure through the frost-covered window. Someone was definitely inside, and given the storm's intensity, they were either desperate or running from something worse than nature's fury. He knocked firmly on the solid wooden door. "Park Service. Anyone in there?" A muffled crash came from within, followed by rapid footsteps. Jake tried the handle and found it unlocked. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a scene that made him pause. Inside, huddled by a dying fire, sat a woman barely out of her teens, her belly swollen with pregnancy, terror etched across her face. She clutched a worn leather bag like her life depended on it. "Please," she whispered, "don't let them find me." Jake stepped inside and closed the door against the howling wind. The cabin was sparse but functional. Someone had clearly prepared it recently. Canned goods sat on the dusty shelves, and a sleeping bag was spread near the fireplace. The woman's dark hair hung in tangled strands around her pale face, and her clothes looked expensive despite being wrinkled and dirty. "I'm Jake, a park ranger," he said, keeping his voice calm and removing his snow-covered hat. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she said, then immediately looked like she regretted giving him even that much information. Jake noticed her hands trembling as she gripped the bag tighter. He'd seen that look before, the wide-eyed fear of someone who knew death was hunting them. It was a look that brought back memories he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. "Sarah, I need to know what's going on. This storm isn't letting up anytime soon, and if someone's in trouble—" "You don't understand," she interrupted, struggling to her feet. "They killed my husband. They killed Agent Morrison. They'll kill anyone who tries to help me." The mention of an agent made Jake's blood run cold. He studied her face more carefully, noting the way she kept glancing toward the windows, the practiced way she positioned herself with exits in view. This wasn't just some lost hiker. "What kind of agent?" Jake asked carefully. Sarah's eyes searched his face, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. "FBI. David Morrison was supposed to get me somewhere safe, but they found us at the motel in Kalispell. I barely got away." Jake's mind raced. Federal agents, safe houses, people being hunted. It all sounded terrifyingly familiar. He'd left the U.S. Marshals Service precisely to avoid these situations, taking the ranger job specifically because it was supposed to be quiet, isolated, safe. "What's in the bag, Sarah?" She hesitated, then slowly unzipped the leather satchel. Inside, nestled among some clothes and personal items, was a small flash drive and several documents with official letterheads. Even from across the room, Jake could see the FBI seal on one of the papers. "Evidence," she said simply, "about people in very high places doing very bad things. My husband worked for them before he realized what they really were. When he tried to come forward, she trailed off, her hand moving protectively to her belly. Jake felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He'd walked away from witness protection cases because of moments exactly like this one. Too many good people had died on his watch. Too many families destroyed because he couldn't keep them safe. But looking at Sarah, young, pregnant, and clearly terrified, he knew he couldn't walk away. "Not again." "How far along are you?" he asked. 7 months, she said. The baby wasn't supposed to come into this world running and hiding. Outside, the wind intensified, rattling the cabin's windows. Jake checked his radio again, but the storm was jamming everything. They were completely cut off, which meant if Sarah's pursuers were determined enough to brave the blizzard, no help would be coming. "We need to talk," Jake said, settling into a chair across from her, "about who these people are, what they want, and how we're going to keep you alive until this storm passes." Sarah nodded, clutching the bag closer. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "The evidence isn't just about them. It's about a federal marshal who disappeared 3 years ago, Jake Sullivan." The woman's eyes darted toward the bag like a cornered animal watching a predator circle closer. Marcus noticed the subtle shift in her breathing, the way her fingers pressed deeper into the rough wool of the blanket. "It's okay," he said, raising his hands in what he hoped was a calming gesture. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Marcus Chen. I'm a park ranger here." She studied his face in the flickering lamplight, searching for something. Trust, maybe, or lies. The wind hammered against the cabin walls with renewed fury, making the decision for both of them. She wasn't going anywhere tonight, and neither was he. "Sarah," she whispered finally. "My name is Sarah." Marcus nodded, settling back into the chair he'd pulled up near the fireplace. The bag sat between them like an unexploded bomb. "When's the last time you ate something, Sarah?" Her hand moved instinctively to her belly. "Yesterday, maybe the day before. I lose track." He reached into his pack and pulled out 2 energy bars and a thermos of coffee that was still warm. Her eyes followed his movements with hungry desperation, but she didn't reach for the food until he placed it on the floor halfway between them and backed away. She tore into the first energy bar like she hadn't eaten in weeks. Marcus watched her carefully, noting the healing bruise along her jawline that makeup couldn't quite hide, the way she favored her left side when she moved. Someone had hurt her. Recently. "How far along are you?" he asked gently. 7 months. She paused mid-bite. "Maybe 8. I haven't exactly been keeping regular doctor appointments." "The storm should break by morning," he said. "I can get you to town, help you find somewhere safe." "No." The word came out sharp and final. "No police, no hospitals, no official anything. Sarah, if someone hurt you, you don't understand." She clutched the blanket tighter. "This isn't about some abusive boyfriend. This is—" She trailed off, her gaze drifting to the bag again. Marcus followed her look. The zipper was partially open, and he could see the corner of what looked like a manila folder peeking out. There were other things too, a cell phone with a cracked screen, what might have been a USB drive, and something metallic that caught the firelight. "What's in the bag, Sarah?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Outside, the wind had taken on an almost human quality, howling and moaning around the cabin's corners. The temperature was still dropping. Even with the fire, Marcus could see his breath in the air. "Information," she said finally, "about people who do very bad things. People who have a lot to lose if that information gets out." A chill ran down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "What kind of information?" Sarah's laugh was hollow, bitter. "The kind that gets people killed, the kind that makes pregnant women run into blizzards because it's safer than staying home." She reached for the bag with trembling fingers, hesitating before pulling out the manila folder. It was thick, stuffed with papers and photographs. Even from where he sat, Marcus could see official-looking letterheads and what appeared to be surveillance photos. "My husband," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "He worked for a private military contractor. Blackwater-type stuff, but smaller, more specialized. He thought he was doing the right thing, serving his country, even after leaving the army." She opened the folder slightly, and Marcus caught a glimpse of what looked like military personnel files. He found out they weren't just taking government contracts. Marcus leaned forward despite himself. "What do you mean?" "Human trafficking, arms dealing. They were using their government connections and military credentials to run operations in places where American soldiers died, places where my husband's friends died." Her voice cracked. "When he tried to blow the whistle, they killed him, made it look like a training accident." The metallic object in the bag caught the light again, and Marcus realized it was a military dog tag. His chest tightened with a familiar ache, the same one he felt every time he thought about his own brother David, killed in Afghanistan 3 years ago in what the army had called a routine training exercise gone wrong. "How do you know all this?" Marcus asked, though part of him was afraid of the answer. Sarah pulled out a small digital recorder, its red light blinking softly, because he recorded everything, every meeting, every conversation, every order. He knew they were planning something, so he documented it all. She looked up at Marcus, tears streaming down her face. "And now they know I have it." The dog tag shifted in the bag, and Marcus's blood turned to ice. Even from across the space between them, he could make out a name etched into the metal, Sergeant David Chen. The woman's eyes darted between Marcus and the door like a trapped animal calculating escape routes. Her breathing came in short, visible puffs in the frigid cabin air, and her hands trembled as she pulled the threadbare blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I can't go anywhere," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind howling through the gaps in the cabin walls. "Not yet. They'll be watching the roads, the hospitals, everywhere." Marcus kept his distance, sensing that any sudden movement might send her bolting into the storm. "Who's watching? What kind of trouble are you in?" She shook her head violently, dark hair whipping across her face. "You don't understand. If they find me—" Her words trailed off as another contraction gripped her, forcing her to double over with a sharp gasp. He moved closer despite her obvious fear. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but that baby isn't going to wait for better weather. How far apart are the contractions?" Marcus pulled out his satellite phone, checking the signal. "1 bar, barely functional in the storm, but it might be enough. I'm calling for medical assistance. Whatever you're running from, we'll figure it out later." "Oh!" Her scream cut through the wind like a blade. She lunged forward, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. "Please, you can't call anyone. They have people everywhere. Dispatch, hospitals, police departments. The moment you make that call, they'll know exactly where I am." The desperation in her voice gave him pause. In his 15 years as a ranger, he'd encountered plenty of people running from something, abusive partners, creditors, the law. But this felt different. The terror in her eyes was too raw, too immediate to be anything but genuine. "Then what do you suggest?" he asked, gently removing her hand from his wrist. "Because, ready or not, this baby is coming." She leaned back against the wall, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "I have supplies in my bag, basic medical stuff. I hoped I could handle this alone." Marcus glanced at the worn duffel bag in the corner, then back at her pale face. "You're talking about delivering a baby by yourself in an abandoned cabin during a blizzard. That's not brave, it's suicide. Better than the alternative," she muttered, but her resolve seemed to be weakening with each wave of pain. He made a decision. "I have basic medical training from my time in the service. It's not ideal, but if you really won't let me call for help, I can assist with the delivery." Hope flickered in her eyes for the first time since he'd found her. "You'd do that? Even though you don't know me?" "It's what anyone would do." Marcus moved to examine the cabin's resources. The old stone fireplace might provide warmth if he could get it working, and there was a hand pump that might still draw water from the well. "But I need to know what I'm dealing with. Who's after you?" She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow. "People who don't want this baby to exist. People who have enough power to make problems disappear permanently." A chill ran down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "What kind of people?" "The kind who can make a car accident look completely random," she said, unconsciously placing a protective hand over her belly. "The kind who can arrange for medical records to vanish, or for someone to simply never make it home from work one day." Marcus felt the pieces of a larger, darker puzzle shifting in his mind. "Is the father dead?" The word came out flat and final. 3 months ago. Officially, it was a heart attack. David was 28 years old and ran marathons. Another contraction hit, stronger this time, and she gripped the edge of the wooden crate she was sitting on until her knuckles went white. When it passed, she looked up at him with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. "I need to get something from my bag," she said, struggling to stand. "Something you should see before you decide whether to help me or not." Marcus watched as she stumbled to the duffel bag, her movements awkward and pained. She unzipped a side pocket and pulled out what looked like a small digital recorder, her hands shaking as she held it out to him. "This is why they killed David," she said. "This is why they want me dead. And after you hear what's on it, they'll probably want you dead too." The recorder felt heavier than it should have in Marcus's palm, weighted with implications he wasn't sure he was ready to understand. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, as if nature itself was trying to keep the secrets buried in this forgotten place. The woman's scream pierced through the howling wind like a blade. Marcus dropped the flashlight, its beam spinning wildly across the cabin floor as he rushed to her side. She was doubled over on the makeshift bed, her face contorted in agony, hands clutching her swollen belly. "Is it the baby?" he asked, though the answer was written in her desperate gasps. She nodded, unable to speak through gritted teeth. When the contraction passed, she collapsed back against the wall, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat despite the freezing temperature. "How far apart?" Marcus knelt beside her, his mind racing through half-remembered first aid training from years ago. 10 minutes, maybe less. Her voice was barely a whisper. "It's too early. I'm only 36 weeks. Marcus glanced toward the door, where the blizzard raged with increasing fury. Even if he could reach his truck, the roads would be impassable. The nearest hospital was 40 miles away, through mountain passes that would be death traps in this weather. His radio had been silent for hours. The storm was blocking all communication. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Sarah." She winced as another wave of pain began building. "Sarah Chen." "Okay, Sarah. I'm Marcus. We're going to get through this together." He moved to stoke the fire, adding more wood to drive back the cold that seemed to seep through every crack in the old cabin walls. "Do you have any medical training?" She shook her head, then gasped as the contraction hit full force. This one lasted longer, and Marcus could see the fear in her eyes when it finally subsided. "They're getting closer," she panted. Marcus grabbed his pack and began inventorying their supplies. A first aid kit, some clean shirts, a bottle of water, energy bars. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He'd assisted with a birth once before, years ago when he was stationed overseas, but that had been with proper medical equipment and a trained medic leading the way. "Sarah, I need to ask you something important." He returned to her side, noting how pale she'd become. "Are you alone? Is there someone I should try to contact?" Her eyes darted away from his. "No, there's no one." The lie was obvious, but Marcus didn't press. Whatever had driven her out into this storm was clearly something she wasn't ready to discuss. Right now, keeping her and the baby alive was all that mattered. Another contraction gripped her, and this time Marcus could see the intensity had increased dramatically. When it passed, Sarah grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Something's wrong," she whispered. "This isn't how it's supposed to feel." Marcus felt his chest tighten. In the dim firelight, he could see that her breathing had become shallow and rapid. Her skin was taking on a grayish pallor that he recognized from his military days. Shock was setting in. "Try to stay calm," he said, though his own pulse was racing. "Breathe with me, in through your nose, out through your mouth." As Sarah focused on her breathing, Marcus quickly checked her pulse at her wrist. It was weak and thready. He needed to keep her warm and elevate her feet. But first he had to figure out what was causing the complications. "Sarah, have you had any bleeding? Any fluid?" She shook her head, then suddenly gripped the edge of the sleeping bag. "Oh God, something's happening." Marcus grabbed the flashlight and saw what she meant. Her water had broken, but the fluid was tinged with an ominous dark color that made his stomach drop. He'd seen enough battlefield injuries to know that blood where it shouldn't be was never a good sign. "Listen to me," he said, forcing authority into his voice. "We can do this. Thousands of babies have been born in worse conditions than this. But even as he spoke the words, Marcus knew they were in serious trouble. The baby was coming whether they were ready or not, and without proper medical intervention, both Sarah and her child were at risk. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and his radio remained stubbornly silent. Sarah's next contraction came with barely a minute's break, and she cried out in pain that seemed different somehow, sharper, more urgent. Marcus realized with growing dread that they might only have hours, or even minutes, before this situation became critical. He thought of the bag still sitting unopened by the door, its contents a mystery that had seemed so important just an hour ago. Now it felt insignificant compared to the life-and-death drama unfolding before him. Whatever secrets Sarah was carrying would have to wait. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and Marcus felt the weight of isolation pressing down on them. They were completely cut off from the world, with only his limited skills standing between Sarah and disaster. The next contraction began, and Marcus steeled himself for what was coming. The woman's eyes darted between Marcus and the photograph, her breathing becoming more erratic. She pressed herself deeper into the corner of the couch, pulling the blanket tighter around her swollen belly. "Where did you get this?" Marcus's voice came out rougher than he intended. His hands trembled as he held the image of his father in the ranger uniform, standing beside a patrol car that looked decades old. Marcus set the photograph on the coffee table and raised his hands in what he hoped was a calming gesture. "Nobody's going to hurt you here, I promise. But I need to understand what's happening. This is my father." Her eyes widened in recognition, and she studied his face with new intensity. "You look like him," she whispered. "God, you really look like him. You knew him." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the photograph. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "He tried to help my mother." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He sank into the chair across from her, his mind racing. His father had died when Marcus was 12, killed in what everyone said was a hunting accident deep in these same woods. The official report claimed he'd fallen from a ridge while tracking a wounded deer, but Marcus had always sensed there were pieces missing from that story. "What do you mean he tried to help her?" "My mother was like me," she said, one hand instinctively moving to her belly. "Pregnant, running from the same people I'm running from now." "What people?" She flinched at the question, glancing toward the windows as if expecting to see faces pressed against the glass. "You don't understand. This goes back generations. Families, bloodlines, people with money and power who think they own everything, including us." Marcus leaned forward, trying to keep his voice gentle despite the urgency building inside him. "Tell me about my father, please." She closed her eyes, and for a moment he thought she might retreat back into silence. But then she began to speak, her words coming in a rush as if a dam had burst. 25 years ago, my mother escaped from a place called Blackwood Estate. It's up in the mountains, hidden away where nobody can hear what goes on there. She was 17, pregnant with me, and she ran during a snowstorm just like this one. Your father found her collapsed near the old mining road." Marcus's blood ran cold. He knew that road. It was in the most remote section of his patrol area, a place where the forest grew so thick that GPS signals failed and compasses spun uselessly. "He should have turned her over to the authorities," she continued. "That's what they expected him to do. But he saw what they'd done to her. The marks, the brands. He knew she wasn't just some runaway. Brands?" She hesitated, then slowly pushed up the sleeve of her shirt. There, burned into the pale skin of her forearm, was a symbol Marcus didn't recognize. A twisted tree with roots that looked like grasping fingers. "They mark their property," she said simply. The cabin felt colder suddenly, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Marcus stared at the scar, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "Your father hid my mother for weeks," she went on. "Brought her food, medicine. He was trying to figure out how to get her somewhere safe when they found out." "They?" The people from Blackwood. They have connections everywhere. Police, government, courts, money talks, and they have more of it than you can imagine. When they discovered your father was helping her, she trailed off, but Marcus could see the answer in her eyes. The hunting accident, he said quietly. She nodded. They made it look like an accident, just like they'll make it look like an accident if they find me. Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him, like tectonic plates grinding against each other. Everything he thought he knew about his father's death, about his own life, was crumbling. What happened to your mother? They got her eventually, took her back. I was born at Blackwood, raised there until I was old enough to... She stopped, unwilling or unable to finish the sentence. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling past in ghostly columns. Marcus realized he was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. And now you're running from them too. I escaped 3 days ago. I've been moving through the forest ever since, trying to stay ahead of them. When the storm hit, I thought maybe I could hide long enough for the baby to be born somewhere safe. She looked at him with desperate hope, and Marcus felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. The snow had stopped falling, but the silence outside felt more ominous than the howling wind. Marcus stood at the cabin window, watching the pale morning light filter through the heavy clouds, while Sarah remained curled on the couch behind him. The photograph lay on the table between them like an unexploded bomb. "Tell me about the night my family died," he said without turning around. Sarah's breathing became shallow. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Stop lying." Marcus faced her, his jaw tight. "That's my sister in the photo, my parents, my house, and you're standing there like you belonged." She struggled to sit up straighter, one hand protective over her belly. "You don't understand what you're asking. Try me." The silence stretched between them until Sarah finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was 16, a runaway. Your family, they took me in for a few weeks that summer. Your parents were kind to me when no one else was." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. "Took you in? My parents never mentioned. It was unofficial. Your mother found me sleeping in the park. She convinced your father to let me stay in the guest room just until I got back on my feet." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I was going to leave the next morning, August 15th. But the fire, you were there." The words came out as an accusation. "You were in the house when it happened." "No." Sarah shook her head violently. "I left that night. I couldn't sleep, so I went for a walk around midnight. When I came back..." She closed her eyes. "The whole street was lit up, fire trucks everywhere. Your neighbors were standing on their lawns, watching it burn. Because I was terrified." Sarah's voice broke. "A 16-year-old runaway with a history of petty theft? Who would have believed I wasn't involved? I had no ID. No real name I was using back then. I was a ghost. But you saw something." Marcus moved closer, studying her face. "That's why they're after you now, isn't it? You witnessed who really started that fire." Sarah's silence was answer enough. "Who was it?" Marcus demanded. "Who killed my family?" Before Sarah could respond, the baby kicked hard enough that she gasped and doubled over. Marcus instinctively moved to help her, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I need to use the bathroom," she said, struggling to her feet. Marcus watched her shuffle toward the small cabin bathroom, noting how she avoided his eyes. Something wasn't right about her story. The timeline felt off, the details too rehearsed. He'd spent 15 years believing his family died in an accidental electrical fire. The official report had been conclusive. Faulty wiring in the basement had sparked the blaze that consumed everything. But if Sarah was telling the truth about being there, about seeing something... The sound of retching came from the bathroom, followed by Sarah's muffled sobs. Marcus found himself torn between his desperate need for answers and an unexpected surge of protective instinct. Pregnant, terrified, and clearly in physical distress, she was hardly in a position to be interrogated. He walked back to the table and picked up the photograph, studying it more carefully. Sarah looked so young, almost fragile. standing beside his mother in their kitchen. His mother's arm was around the girl's shoulders in a gesture of warmth that Marcus remembered well. Catherine Walsh had always been a champion of strays, both animal and human. But something else in the photo caught his attention. In the background, partially visible through the kitchen window, was a man's silhouette, someone standing in their backyard watching the house. Marcus felt his blood turn cold. He'd never noticed this detail before, but then again, he'd blocked out most memories of that summer. The trauma counselors had said it was normal, the mind's way of protecting itself from associated pain. "Sarah," Marcus said more gently, "I need to know, who was watching my house?" She sank back onto the couch, her hands trembling as she covered her face. "The same man who's been hunting me for 15 years, she whispered. "The same man who's the father of this baby." The photograph trembled in Marcus's weathered hands as memories crashed over him like an avalanche. 23 years dissolved in an instant, and he was back in that sterile hospital room, holding his newborn daughter for the first and last time before the social worker took her away. Sarah Michelle Crane, the name he'd whispered to her tiny, perfect face, promising he'd find her someday when he got clean, when he became the father she deserved. "Where did you get this?" His voice cracked like breaking ice. Sarah's eyes darted between his face and the door, her body coiled to run despite her condition. "You know her, don't you? The woman in the picture?" Marcus studied the photograph again. It showed a woman in her 40s with Sarah's same dark hair and stubborn chin, standing beside a man in an expensive suit outside what looked like a courthouse. The woman wore the hollow expression of someone who'd lost everything that mattered. "That's my adoptive mother, Rebecca Whitmore," Sarah whispered. "She died 3 months ago. Car accident, they said, but..." She pulled another item from the bag, a manila envelope thick with documents. "I found these hidden in her bedroom wall after the funeral." Marcus's hands shook as he opened the envelope. Birth certificates, legal documents, newspaper clippings, all bearing his name, Sarah's birth name, and details about the custody case he'd been too strung out to fight. But there were other papers too, ones that made his blood run cold. Financial records showing payments made to Judge Harrison Caldwell over 2 decades. Adoption agencies that didn't exist. Children who'd disappeared from the system without a trace. And at the center of it all, a name that made Marcus's stomach lurch, Vincent Carrera. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "Carrera's been trafficking kids through the adoption system." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Rebecca wasn't just my adoptive mother. She was a social worker who discovered the network 23 years ago when she was assigned to my case. But instead of exposing it, they made her part of it. She took me to keep me safe, but she's been paying them ever since to protect me." The pieces clicked together in Marcus's mind like a puzzle from hell. And now she's dead. They killed her because she was going to tell the truth. She left me these documents and a letter explaining everything. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "Including the fact that she'd been in contact with my biological father, you, for the past 5 years. Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. "What?" "She found you after you got clean, after you became a park ranger. She wanted to reunite us, but she was terrified they'd kill us both if they found out." Sarah pulled out one final item, a letter written in careful script. "She was planning to bring me here, to you, after the baby was born, somewhere remote where we could disappear." The blizzard howled outside, but Marcus barely heard it. His daughter, had been living a nightmare while he'd been hiking mountains and rescuing lost tourists, completely unaware she existed in anything but his dreams and regrets. Why didn't she just go to the police? Marcus stared at the photograph of Rebecca Whitmore again, seeing the truth in her haunted eyes. A woman who'd sacrificed everything to protect a child that wasn't even hers, trapped in a web of corruption that stretched back decades. So, what changed? Why are you running now? They found out Rebecca was planning to expose them. After she died, they came for me. Sarah's hand moved protectively to her belly. They want the baby, just like they wanted me. Fresh inventory for their network. The radio crackled to life in the corner, making them both jump. Marcus moved to answer it, recognizing the voice of his supervisor calling for a check-in. But as he reached for the handset, Sarah grabbed his arm. "Don't trust anyone," she pleaded. Rebecca's letter mentioned a mole in the park service, someone who's been watching you, reporting back to them. Marcus's hand froze over the radio. He thought about the convenient timing of his current assignment, the way he'd been sent to this remote cabin right when Sarah needed shelter. The coincidence suddenly felt a lot less coincidental. Outside, the wind seemed to carry a different sound, the distant rumble of snowmobile engines cutting through the storm. Sarah heard it too, her face going white with terror. "They found us," she whispered. Marcus grabbed his rifle from beside the door and checked the ammunition. His daughter had been running for months, carrying secrets that could destroy a criminal network spanning decades. Now she was trapped in a cabin with nowhere left to run, and the storm that had seemed like their protection was about to become their tomb. The engines grew louder, closer, and Marcus realized their time had just run out. The blizzard had intensified, howling through the trees with a vengeance that made the cabin walls shudder. Marcus sat frozen at the small wooden table, the photograph trembling in his hands as Sarah watched him with eyes that held too many secrets. "Where did you get this?" His voice came out hoarse, barely audible above the storm. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, one hand instinctively moving to her belly. "It was in my mother's things after she died. She told me to find you if anything ever happened to her." The photograph showed a younger version of Marcus standing beside a woman with Sarah's dark hair and striking green eyes. They were both smiling, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. Behind them stood a modest house with blue shutters that he remembered painting one sunny weekend 23 years ago. "Elena," he whispered, the name cutting through him like broken glass. Marcus set the photo down carefully, as if it might disintegrate at his touch. "We were going to be married. She disappeared one night without explanation. I never saw her again." Sarah reached into the bag and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellow with age. His name was written across it in Elena's familiar handwriting. "She left this for you." His hands shook as he opened it, the paper crackling with age. Elena's words swam before his eyes as memories he'd buried came flooding back. "Sarah is his daughter, but she's nothing like him. She's kind and gentle, everything good that he isn't. Please protect her like you once protected me. The briefcase she carries contains evidence that could destroy him, but it also makes her a target, and never stopped loving you. Elena." Marcus looked up to find Sarah watching him intently. "You're Crenshaw's daughter." She nodded, her jaw tightening. "And you hate me for it." "No." The word came out more forcefully than he intended. "But it explains why he's so desperate to find you." Through the window, Marcus caught a glimpse of light moving through the trees. He killed the lantern immediately, plunging them into darkness. "Get away from the windows," he whispered urgently. They crouched behind the overturned table as footsteps crunched through the snow outside. Marcus counted at least 3 different gates, maybe 4. His service weapon felt inadequate against those odds, especially with Sarah to protect. A voice called out, barely audible above the wind. "We know you're in there, Sarah. Your father just wants to talk." Sarah's breathing became rapid and shallow. Marcus placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, feeling her trembling beneath his touch. "He's not my father," she whispered fiercely. "Not anymore." The front door exploded inward, sending splinters of wood flying across the room. Dark figures moved through the doorframe, their tactical gear making them look like shadows given form. Marcus fired twice, his muzzle flash briefly illuminating the room. One figure dropped, but the others immediately returned fire, bullets chewing through the thin cabin walls. "The back window," Marcus hissed, helping Sarah to her feet. They stayed low, moving toward the rear of the cabin as more gunfire erupted. Marcus kicked out the window frame and helped Sarah climb through into the swirling snow beyond. The cold hit them like a physical blow. Sarah gasped, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Behind them, flashlight beams swept through the cabin's interior. "This way," Marcus said, leading her toward the tree line. The snow was knee-deep and getting deeper, making every step a struggle. Sarah stumbled, and Marcus caught her arm, supporting her weight as they pushed forward. "I can't," she panted. "The baby—" "You can. We're almost to the old ranger station. There's a radio there." Marcus pulled Sarah behind a massive pine tree just as a beam passed inches from where they'd been standing. Her face was pale in the darkness, her lips tinged blue from the cold. He thought of Elena, of the life they'd planned together, of the 23 years he'd spent wondering what he'd done wrong. Now, her daughter, their daughter, in every way that mattered, was depending on him. The briefcase felt heavier in Sarah's grip as more voices echoed through the forest. Whatever evidence it contained, Crenshaw was willing to kill for it. And Marcus was the only thing standing between Sarah and her father's men. The wind had died to a whisper by the time Marcus finished reading the final page of his father's journal. The silence felt heavy, pregnant with secrets that had been buried for 23 years. Sarah sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, watching his face as the truth settled in. "Your father saved my life," she said quietly. "When the consortium found out I was pregnant with evidence that could destroy them, he got me out. He died protecting us both." Marcus set the journal down with trembling fingers. The man he'd grown up believing was a coward, a drunk who'd abandoned his family, had actually been a hero. Thomas Kane hadn't disappeared. He'd been murdered for trying to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and corporate power. "The baby," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. "What happened to the baby?" Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her current pregnancy. She was adopted. Safe family, new identity. I never saw her again. Her eyes filled with tears. It was the only way to keep her alive. A sudden sound outside made them both freeze. It wasn't the wind. Footsteps crunched through the snow, deliberate and careful. Marcus grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the boards he'd nailed up earlier. 3 figures in white winter gear moved through the trees, barely visible against the snow. They carried military-grade weapons and moved with the precision of trained operatives. The consortium had found them. "How?" Marcus whispered, but even as he asked, he knew. The GPS tracker in Sarah's car hadn't been the only one. They'd probably been monitoring his radio communications, tracking his Ranger vehicle, watching and waiting for the storm to pass enough for them to move in. Sarah was already gathering the documents, stuffing them back into the bag with practiced efficiency. "There's a back way out through the root cellar," she said. "I scouted it when I first arrived." Marcus shook his head. "You're 8 months pregnant. You can't run through deep snow in this cold." He checked his rifle, then grabbed extra ammunition from his pack. "I'll hold them off, give you time to hide." "No," Sarah grabbed his arm. "You don't understand what these people are capable of. They killed your father, and they'll kill you without hesitation." The front door exploded inward in a shower of splinters. Marcus shoved Sarah behind the kitchen counter and opened fire. The first man through the door dropped, but 2 more followed immediately, spreading out with professional efficiency. "Federal agents," one shouted. "Nobody has to die here." Marcus almost laughed at the lie. These weren't federal agents. They were corporate assassins with government clearance. He put 2 shots into the wall where the second man had taken cover, forcing him back. Sarah was crawling toward the cellar door, the bag clutched against her chest. A window shattered as someone outside tried to get a clear shot. Marcus realized they were surrounded. "Kane!" The voice came from outside, amplified by some kind of speaker. "We know who you are. Your father made the same mistake you're making now. Don't repeat his errors." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. They knew. They'd always known who he was, where he was. They'd been watching him his entire life, probably making sure he never got too close to the truth about his father's death. A grenade rolled through the broken window. Marcus dove toward Sarah, tackling her behind the heavy wooden table just as the explosion ripped through the cabin. His ears rang and smoke filled the air. When he looked up, flames were already spreading across the far wall. "Move!" he shouted, hauling Sarah to her feet. They stumbled toward the cellar door as boots thundered across the floor above. Marcus yanked open the heavy wooden door, revealing steep stairs descending into darkness. Sarah went first, her movements awkward but determined. Marcus followed, pulling the door shut behind them just as gunfire erupted in the kitchen. Bullets punched through the wooden door, sending splinters raining down on them. The cellar was small and cramped, filled with the smell of earth and decay. Sarah was already at the far end, pulling away boards from what looked like a tunnel entrance. "Old bootlegger's route," she gasped, "connects to a cave system about half a mile away." The door above them splintered further. Soon their pursuers would realize where they'd gone. Marcus helped Sarah into the tunnel, then squeezed in behind her. The space was barely wide enough for his shoulders, and ice formed on the walls where their breath hit the frigid air. Behind them, the cabin burned. Ahead lay only darkness and the desperate hope that the tunnel wouldn't collapse or lead them into a dead end. Sarah crawled forward with grim determination, protecting the bag that contained the only evidence that could bring down the people who'd destroyed both their lives. Marcus followed, his father's journal pressed against his chest, finally understanding that the past never really dies. It just waits in the darkness for someone brave enough to drag it into the light. The photograph trembled in Marcus's hands as recognition crashed over him like an avalanche. His father's face stared back at him, younger but unmistakable, standing beside a woman Marcus had never seen before. But it wasn't just any woman. It was Elena's mother, her features clearly visible in the faded image despite the years that had passed. Elena's eyes never left his face, studying every micro-expression. "My mother kept it hidden in a safety deposit box. I only found it after she died last year, along with other documents I didn't understand at the time." Marcus set the photograph on the table with deliberate care, his mind racing through implications he wasn't ready to accept. This doesn't prove anything. Maybe they just worked together, or look at the back. With trembling fingers, he flipped the photograph over. In his father's distinctive handwriting, words that made his blood run cold. "Sarah and me, 3 months before everything changed. I'm sorry, son. Someday you'll understand why I had to disappear." The cabin felt like it was closing in around him. Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window where the storm continued its relentless assault. The wind howled through the trees with renewed fury, but it was nothing compared to the chaos in his mind. "My father died in a car accident when I was 12, he said, his back still turned to Elena. "There was a funeral. I threw dirt on his coffin. Did you see his body?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Marcus closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember that awful day 20 years ago. The closed casket. His aunt's explanation that the accident had been too severe, that it was better to remember his father as he was. The way the adults had whispered among themselves, falling silent whenever he approached. "The man who's hunting me," Elena continued, her voice gentle but relentless. "His name is Viktor Kozlov. He runs a network that specializes in making people disappear, sometimes permanently, sometimes just relocated. New identities, new lives. My mother worked for him as a forger. She was very good at creating documents that could fool anyone." Marcus turned back to face her, his ranger training warring with his emotional turmoil. "You're saying my father faked his own death?" "I'm saying your father needed to disappear, and my mother helped him do it. But something went wrong. Victor discovered what they'd done, and he's been looking for them both ever since." Elena pulled another document from her bag, a birth certificate that made Marcus's knees nearly buckle. His name, his birth date, but a different father listed. Not James Morrison, the man who'd raised him, but someone named James Kowalski. "Your father was involved in something dangerous before you were born," Elena explained. "The details are scattered, but from what I've pieced together, he witnessed something he shouldn't have. Something that put both of you in immediate danger. So, he just left me?" The words came out harsher than intended, carrying 2 decades of suppressed anger and confusion. "He thought you were safer without him. Victor's people had already started asking questions. If your father had stayed, you both would have ended up dead." Marcus sank back into his chair, the weight of revelation crushing down on him. Everything he'd believed about his life, his identity, his father's death, all of it built on carefully constructed lies. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "What do you want from me?" Elena's hand moved protectively to her belly. "Because Victor found my mother 6 months ago. Before he killed her, she told him about your father, about what she'd done to help him disappear. He knows your father is still alive, and he believes you're the key to finding him. But I haven't seen or heard from my father in 20 years. I don't know anything." "Victor doesn't believe that. He thinks your father would have left you some way to contact him, some clue about where he went. That's why his men grabbed me. They wanted to use me as leverage, thinking they could force information out of you." The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture that terrified Marcus more than any blizzard or armed pursuit. He wasn't just a park ranger who'd stumbled into someone else's nightmare. He was the center of it, the focal point of a decades-old conspiracy that had shaped his entire life without his knowledge. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, but Marcus realized that the real tempest was just beginning. Somewhere out there, his father might still be alive, and somewhere else, Victor Kozlov was coming for them all. The gunshot echoed through the cabin like thunder, and for a heartbeat, everything stopped. Marcus felt the bullet whistle past his ear, splintering the wooden doorframe behind him. Sarah's scream pierced the air as she pressed herself against the far wall, her hands instinctively protecting her belly. "Next one goes through your head, Marcus," the voice called from outside. "Send the woman out. This doesn't have to involve you." Marcus recognized the voice now. Detective Ray Sullivan from the state police. He'd worked with Ray on missing persons cases before, had trusted him. The betrayal cut deeper than the winter wind, howling through the broken window. "She's pregnant," Marcus shouted back, positioning himself between Sarah and the door. "Whatever this is about, she needs medical attention." Ray's laugh was harsh, bitter. "Medical attention? She's got something that belongs to my employer, something worth a lot more than her life or yours." Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm, her grip desperate. "The flash drive," she whispered. "He wants the flash drive. But Marcus, you don't understand. There's more. Your sister—" Another shot shattered what remained of the front window. Glass showered down like deadly snow. Marcus pulled Sarah toward the back of the cabin, his mind racing. The storm was still raging, visibility near zero. If they could make it to the tree line, they might have a chance. "Your sister Emma didn't die in an accident," Sarah gasped as they crouched behind the overturned table. "The pharmaceutical company, they were testing an experimental drug. Children in the foster system. Emma was one of them." Marcus's world tilted. Emma had died of cardiac arrest at 15, 2 years after they'd been separated in foster care. Heart defect, they'd said. Genetic abnormality. "That's impossible," he breathed. But even as he said it, pieces began clicking into place. Emma's last letter, mentioning feeling sick, talking about the special vitamins her foster parents made her take. The substantial settlement her foster family had received after her death, money they'd claimed was from a life insurance policy. "The flash drive has everything," Sarah continued, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Medical records, payments, cover-ups, dozens of children. Your sister was one of the first to die from their experimental compounds." The back door exploded inward. Ray stood silhouetted against the swirling snow, his service weapon trained on them. His face was haggard, desperate. "Enough talking. Give me the drive and I'll make it quick." "How long have you been working for them?" Marcus asked, his hand slowly reaching for the poker beside the fireplace. "Since my daughter needed cancer treatment," Ray said, his voice cracking. "You think a cop's salary covers experimental therapies? They offered me a way to save her life. All I had to do was clean up their messes. By killing children? By keeping secrets!" Ray's hand trembled. Those kids were dying anyway, in the system, forgotten, unwanted. At least their deaths meant something. At least they helped save other children like mine. Sarah's breathing had become labored, her face pale with more than fear. "Marcus," she whispered, "the baby, something's wrong." A dark stain was spreading across her jeans. Blood. The stress, the cold, the fear, it was all taking its toll. Marcus made his choice. In one fluid movement, he grabbed the poker and hurled it at Ray while simultaneously lunging toward the detective. The poker struck Ray's gun hand, sending the weapon spinning across the floor. Both men crashed into the wall, fighting desperately for control. Ray was younger, stronger, but Marcus fought with the fury of a man who'd just learned his sister's death had been murder. They rolled across the floor, each seeking advantage. Ray's elbow caught Marcus in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. Marcus retaliated with a knee to Ray's solar plexus. "Sarah, the gun!" Marcus shouted as he pinned Ray's arms. But Sarah was curled on her side, her face contorted in pain. "I can't. The baby's coming." Ray broke free and scrambled toward his weapon. Marcus dove after him, tackling him just as his fingers closed around the grip. They struggled for control of the gun, rolling closer to the fireplace where the dying embers still glowed. The weapon discharged again, the bullet punching through the ceiling. Marcus managed to get both hands on Ray's wrist, forcing the gun away from Sarah. With desperate strength, he slammed Ray's hand against the stone hearth once, twice, until the detective's grip loosened. The gun skittered away into the shadows. Both men lay gasping, bloodied and exhausted. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but Marcus could hear something else now, the distant sound of engines growing closer. "More of them?" he asked. Ray shook his head weakly. "I came alone. If they knew I'd found her first—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Marcus understood. Ray had been planning to claim the reward for himself. Sarah's moans were becoming more urgent. The baby wasn't waiting for rescue. The photograph trembled in Marcus's hands as the wind howled through the cabin's broken shutters. Sarah's face had gone pale, her eyes fixed on the image of the young woman who looked exactly like her. The resemblance was uncanny, the same delicate features, the same dark eyes, even the same way of holding her head slightly tilted to one side. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Who is she?" "Elena," he said aloud, testing the name. "Do you recognize that name at all?" Sarah shook her head, but something flickered across her features, uncertainty, perhaps even recognition. She shifted uncomfortably, wincing as the baby kicked. "We need to focus on getting out of here," she said, avoiding his gaze. "The storm—" "No." Marcus's voice was firm. "You know something. I can see it in your face." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the relentless battering of wind against the cabin walls. Sarah's breathing had become shallow, and she pressed a hand to her stomach. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush. The pieces began clicking together in Marcus's mind with terrifying clarity. "What was your mother's name?" "Carmen. Carmen Vasquez." Marcus felt the world tilt beneath him. If Elena was Carmen's sister and Sarah was Carmen's daughter, then Elena could be his mother, which would make Sarah his cousin. The woman he'd been protecting, the woman carrying a child while running from killers, was his family. "Jesus," he breathed, sinking onto the edge of the cot. "This can't be coincidence. Those men hunting you, they have to be connected to what happened to Elena." Sarah's face had gone ashen. "You think they killed her?" "I don't know. But someone wanted her gone badly enough to erase every trace of her existence from my life." Marcus stood abruptly, pacing the small space. "The question is why? What did she know? What did she see?" A sharp crack echoed through the cabin, not from the storm, but from outside. Both of them froze. Marcus moved quickly to the window, peering through the gap in the shutters. Through the swirling snow, he could make out dark shapes moving between the trees. 3 figures, maybe 4, advancing methodically toward the cabin. "They found us," he said, his training kicking in immediately. "We need to move, now." Sarah struggled to her feet, pain etched across her face. "I can't. The baby." "You have to." Marcus was already gathering their supplies, shoving everything into the backpack. There's a back window. We can slip out while they're approaching from the front. Another contraction hit Sarah, doubling her over. This one was stronger, lasting longer than the others. When it passed, she looked up at Marcus with fear in her eyes. "I think it's starting," she gasped. "The baby's coming." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. Outside, the dark figures were getting closer. Inside, Sarah was going into labor in the middle of a blizzard, miles from any medical help. And somewhere in between, the truth about his family, about Elena, about why these people wanted Sarah dead, remained locked away. He made a decision that went against every tactical instinct he'd developed over years of law enforcement. Instead of running, he began barricading the door. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, panic rising in her voice. "We're not running anymore," Marcus said grimly, checking his weapon. "You can't travel in labor, and I'm not leaving you defenseless. We make our stand here, but there are too many of them." "Maybe, but they don't know this terrain like I do, and they don't know what we've discovered." He looked at her intently. "That photograph, whatever happened to Elena, it's the key to everything. They're not just hunting you randomly. This is about family, about secrets someone's been keeping for over 30 years. Sarah gripped his arm as another contraction began building. "Promise me," she said through gritted teeth. "Whatever happens, you'll protect the baby. You'll find the truth about Elena." Marcus nodded, though he knew the odds were stacked impossibly against them. Outside, the shapes had reached the tree line. Inside, new life was fighting to enter a world that seemed determined to destroy it before it could draw its first breath. The storm raged on, indifferent to the convergence of past and present, of family bonds forged in blood and terror. Sarah. Her name escaped his lips like a prayer. She flinched at the sound, her eyes darting between his face and the door. "You can't know that name. You can't—" Her voice cracked, and she pressed her hands protectively over her swollen belly. The color drained from Sarah's face. She shook her head violently, backing away from him as far as the couch would allow. "No, Marcus is dead. They told me, they said the fire—" I got out. His throat felt raw. "I tried to find you, but they said you died in the hospital. I saw the death certificate." Sarah's breathing became rapid and shallow. Her eyes, wide with terror and disbelief, searched his face for proof of deception. "Show me your scar," she whispered. Without hesitation, Marcus rolled up his left sleeve, revealing the jagged white line that ran from his wrist to his elbow, a souvenir from the night their foster home burned. Sarah reached out with trembling fingers, tracing the familiar mark. "Oh God." The words came out as a sob. "Oh God, it's really you." Marcus pulled her into his arms as she collapsed against him, 15 years of grief and terror pouring out in broken cries. The storm outside seemed to quiet in deference to their reunion, the wind's howling reduced to a mournful whisper. "I thought I was alone," Sarah gasped between sobs. "All these years I thought I had no one." "You're safe now," Marcus murmured, though even as he said it he knew it wasn't true. "Sarah, who are you running from? Who did this to you?" She pulled back, wiping her eyes with shaking hands. "The same people who burned down the foster home, the same ones who faked my death." Her voice hardened with bitter knowledge. The Covenant. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd heard whispers of it during his years as a ranger, a shadowy organization that operated in the remote regions of the Pacific Northwest. Most people dismissed it as conspiracy theory nonsense, but the law enforcement community knew better. "Why?" Marcus's voice was hoarse. "Why would they want 2 foster kids?" Sarah's laugh was hollow and desperate. "Because we weren't just any foster kids, we were witnesses." She stood unsteadily, moving to the window where she peered through a gap in the boards. "Remember that night before the fire, when we saw the cars coming up to the Hendersons' property next door?" Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. He remembered. 3 black SUVs in the middle of the night, strange voices carrying across the field. They'd watched from their bedroom window as men in dark clothes had entered the Henderson house. The next morning, the Henderson family was gone, and their foster parents had told them the family had moved away suddenly. "We saw them take the Hendersons," Sarah continued, her voice flat with exhaustion. "A family that had been asking too many questions about missing hikers in the national forest. The Covenant couldn't risk us talking, so they eliminated the problem. But why fake your death? Why not just—" Marcus felt sick. "All these years, you've been running from them?" Running, hiding, trying to stay invisible. She moved back to the couch, exhaustion evident in every step. "I thought I'd finally found somewhere safe in Bellingham, found someone who loved me." Her hand moved protectively over her unborn child. "But they found me again." "The father?" Marcus asked gently. Sarah's face crumpled. "They killed him. Made it look like an accident, but I know. They wanted me to know." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They're not just eliminating witnesses anymore, Marcus. They're expanding, taking over, and this baby—" She looked down at her belly. "They think this child has some kind of significance." Before Marcus could ask what she meant, the wind outside suddenly died. The silence was more terrifying than the storm had been. Sarah's eyes went wide with panic. "No," she breathed. "They've found us." Through the gaps in the boarded windows, Marcus saw lights moving through the trees, flashlight beams cutting through the snow like hunting spotlights. The Covenant had arrived, and the storm that had been their protection was lifting. The bunker door slammed shut behind them with a finality that made Sarah's chest tighten. The metallic echo reverberated through the concrete corridor ahead, where emergency lighting cast sickly yellow pools every few feet. Marcus moved with practiced efficiency, his hand never leaving his weapon as he guided them deeper into the underground facility. "This place has been operational since the Cold War," he explained, his voice carrying an odd note of pride. "Modified over the years, of course. Your father was instrumental in the recent upgrades." David's jaw clenched. He never mentioned any of this. "There's a lot James never mentioned." Marcus stopped at a heavy steel door marked with biohazard symbols. "But you're about to understand everything." The door opened with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a laboratory that belonged in a science fiction nightmare. Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens displaying complex genetic sequences and cellular structures. Glass chambers filled with various specimens sat on sterile tables, while ventilation systems hummed overhead with urgent intensity. Sarah instinctively stepped closer to David, her hand protectively covering her belly. "What is this place?" "The future," Marcus said simply, "or at least it was supposed to be." He gestured toward a wall covered in photographs, documents, and what looked like family trees with connecting lines drawn in red ink. "Project Lineage. Your father's life's work, Sarah." She moved closer to the wall, her blood turning cold as she recognized faces in the photographs. Her parents, David's parents, dozens of other couples, all with children. And at the center of it all, a photograph of Dr. Caldwell standing next to a younger version of Marcus, and a man she now realized was David's father. "They were creating bloodlines," David said, his voice hollow with understanding. "Selecting genetic combinations." "Not just selecting," Marcus corrected. "Perfecting." The children born from Project Lineage carried specific genetic markers that made them ideal candidates for the next phase. He walked to one of the computer terminals and pulled up a file. "Enhanced immunity, increased intelligence, superior physical capabilities. You and Sarah represent 25 years of careful genetic cultivation." Sarah felt sick. The fertility clinic where my parents met, the scholarship that brought David's family to the same town. None of it was coincidence. Nothing was coincidence. Marcus turned back to them, and for the first time Sarah saw something almost like regret in his eyes. "Your meeting, your relationship, even your pregnancy, it was all part of the plan. The child you're carrying represents the culmination of decades of work." David stepped forward, anger radiating from every line of his body. "What happened to my parents, to Sarah's?" "They started asking questions. James began having doubts about the project when he saw what the next phase required. Marcus pulled up another file, this one showing medical procedures that made Sarah's stomach lurch. The children would need to be monitored, studied. Their offspring would need to be raised in controlled environments to maximize their potential. "You're talking about concentration camps," Sarah whispered. "I'm talking about evolution." Marcus's voice hardened. "Your parents couldn't see the bigger picture. They were going to expose everything, destroy years of progress because of misguided parental sentiment." The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Sarah remembered her father's increasingly late nights, her mother's worried conversations that stopped when she entered the room, the business trip that had ended in tragedy, the careful way the authorities had handled the investigation. "You killed them," David said, his voice deadly quiet. "I did what was necessary to protect the project." Marcus moved closer, his weapon trained on them. "Just like I'm doing now. The research is too important to be destroyed by emotions." Sarah looked around the laboratory, noting the exits, the equipment that could be used as weapons, the distance to the computers. "What do you want with us?" "You're going to complete what your parents started," Marcus said. "Your child will be born here, raised here, studied here. You'll both participate willingly in the continued research, or—" he let the threat hang in the air. "And if we refuse?" David asked. Marcus smiled coldly. "Then you'll join your parents, but the child will survive. That's what matters." Sarah felt the baby kick, as if responding to the tension in the room. In that moment, she made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of backing down, she stepped forward. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "This child is special, but not in the way you think." She moved closer to the computer terminal, her eyes taking in the data displayed on the screens. "You've been so focused on genetics that you missed something crucial." Marcus frowned. "What are you talking about?" Before he could react, she began typing rapidly, her fingers flying over the keys as she accessed the system's core files. The wind had died to a whisper, but the silence felt more ominous than the storm's fury. Marcus stood at the cabin window, watching the pale dawn light reveal the devastation outside. Trees lay twisted and broken, their branches creating a maze of obstacles that would make any escape route treacherous. Behind him, Elena sat on the edge of the cot, her hands protective over her belly. The photograph lay between them on the small table, the image of his sister Sarah holding a baby that couldn't be anyone but Elena. The resemblance was unmistakable now that he knew what to look for. "She saved my life," Elena said quietly, breaking the tense silence. "Your sister. When Dimitri's men found out I was pregnant, they were going to kill me. Sarah helped me escape." Marcus turned from the window, his jaw tight. How did she get involved with people like that? She didn't know what Dimitri really was at first. None of us did. He presented himself as a successful businessman, charming, generous. By the time we realized the truth about his operations, it was too late. Sarah had seen too much. The radio crackled to life, making them both freeze. Marcus grabbed it quickly, adjusting the frequency. "Suspect is armed and extremely dangerous. All units maintain perimeter." Elena's face went white. "They found us." Marcus switched to another channel, hearing fragments of communication between search teams. They were systematic, professional, not local law enforcement. "How many men does he have?" Marcus asked, checking his rifle's ammunition. "Enough." Elena struggled to stand, wincing. "We have to go. Now. You can barely walk, and there's 3 feet of snow out there. Then we die here, or we die trying. Those are our options." Marcus studied the terrain visible through the window. The storm had created natural barriers, but it had also eliminated most cover. Moving in daylight would expose them, but staying meant certain death. A distant sound made his blood freeze, the low rumble of snowmobiles. "Basement," he said urgently. "There's a root cellar." Elena shook her head. "They'll search everywhere. We need distance." The snowmobile engines grew louder, multiple machines approaching from different directions. Marcus grabbed the emergency pack from his gear, stuffing it with ammunition and supplies. Elena was already pulling on the extra coat he'd given her. "There's a service road about 2 miles northeast," he said. "If we can reach it—" The sound of voices outside cut him off. Close. Too close. Marcus motioned for silence, moving to the window. 3 men in white winter gear were approaching the cabin, automatic weapons visible. Professional hunters, not local thugs. "Back exit," he whispered. They moved carefully toward the rear of the cabin. Marcus eased the door open, revealing the white expanse beyond. The snow was deep but manageable. More importantly, the wind had sculpted drifts that could provide temporary concealment. Elena gripped his arm. "If something happens to me, promise you'll make sure the baby—" "Nothing's happening to you." They slipped out into the cold, Marcus supporting Elena as they moved toward the tree line. The snow crunched softly under their feet, each step feeling impossibly loud. Behind them, he heard the cabin door crash open. The forest offered better cover, but progress was agonizingly slow. Elena's breathing became labored, and Marcus could see exhaustion creeping across her features. They couldn't maintain this pace. Shouts erupted from the cabin. Angry voices, commands barked in what sounded like Russian. They'd been discovered missing. "This way," Marcus whispered, leading Elena deeper into the woods. The trees were dense here, creating a natural maze. The storm had brought down enough branches to create hiding spots, but it also made movement treacherous. Elena stumbled, catching herself against a tree trunk. "I can't," she gasped. "Yes, you can." Marcus pulled her arm over his shoulder. "Sarah didn't save you, so you could give up now." The mention of his sister seemed to give Elena strength. They pressed forward, following a game trail that Marcus hoped would lead toward the service road. Behind them, the pursuit was systematic and relentless. The men spread out, calling to each other as they tracked through the snow. These weren't street criminals. They were trained professionals, patient and methodical. A helicopter's distant rotors added to the chorus of pursuit. Dmitri had committed serious resources to finding Elena, which meant whatever she knew was worth killing for. "The file," Marcus said suddenly. "In your bag. What's really in it?" Elena's eyes met his as they stumbled through the snow. Everything. Financial records, shipping manifests, photographs. Enough to destroy his entire network and put him away forever. "Sarah helped you get it? She died getting it." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His sister hadn't just been in the wrong place, she'd been murdered for trying to do the right thing. The grief and rage that surged through him felt like fuel, driving him forward despite the impossible odds. The helicopter was getting closer, its rotors cutting through the morning air like a blade. The silence in the cabin stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the wind's relentless howling outside. Marcus stared at the photograph in his trembling hands. His father, young and smiling, standing beside a woman he'd never seen before. But it was the third figure that made his blood run cold. Thomas Kellerman, decades younger, but unmistakably the same man who had been hunting Sarah across half the state. "I don't understand," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. "My father died when I was 5. Car accident." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "That's what they told you. What they had to tell you." She reached for another photograph, this one showing the same 3 people around a table covered in documents. "Your father worked for a government program. Classified. Deep black operations that officially never existed." Marcus felt the world tilting beneath him. The photograph showed his father, the man he barely remembered but had idealized his entire life, shaking hands with Kellerman. Both men wore military uniforms he didn't recognize, and Kellerman killed him for it, Marcus said, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Not just killed him. They made it look like an accident, then spent the next 30 years making sure anyone who knew the truth disappeared. Sarah's hand found his arm. "Your father hid evidence. Insurance, he called it. Evidence that could bring down the entire operation." Marcus stared at the documents, his father's handwriting visible on several pages. The man he'd mourned as a child, whose absence had shaped his entire life, had been murdered for trying to do the right thing. "How do you know all this?" "Because my husband found your father's evidence 3 months ago." Sarah's voice cracked. David was investigating a series of missing persons cases that seemed unconnected. Military contractors, whistleblowers, journalists who got too close to certain stories. But there was a pattern. They all led back to nightfall. The cabin shuddered as another gust of wind slammed into it. Marcus realized that the storm, as deadly as it was, had become their unlikely protector. Kellerman's men couldn't move in this weather any more than they could. David traced the evidence to a safety deposit box your father had rented under an assumed name. He'd been paying the fees through an automated account for decades, waiting for someone to find it. Sarah pulled out a small brass key. "This was with David's things when they killed him. I think your father hoped that someday, when you were old enough, you'd come looking for the truth." Marcus took the key, its weight seemingly impossible for such a small object. "What's in the box?" "Proof. Video recordings, financial documents, photographs of experiments they conducted on unwilling subjects. Names, dates, locations. Everything needed to expose what Nightfall really was." Sarah met his eyes. "And evidence of current operations. Marcus, they're still active, still destroying lives." The implications crashed over him like an avalanche. His choice to become a park ranger, to live in isolation, to avoid forming close connections, it had all been shaped by the lie of his father's death. Meanwhile, the men responsible had continued their work, leaving a trail of destruction spanning decades. "Why didn't my father just release it himself?" Marcus asked. "He was going to, but they got to him first." Sarah's expression hardened. "Kellerman personally oversaw your father's murder, made sure it looked accidental. Your mother never knew the truth." Marcus thought of his mother, who had struggled for years after his father's death, working multiple jobs to keep them afloat. She died believing her husband had simply lost control of his car on an icy road. The injustice of it burned in his chest. "The safety deposit box is in Missoula," Sarah continued. "David was heading there when they caught up with him. If we can reach it, when this storm passes, Kellerman will come." Marcus interrupted. "He's not going to let us walk away from this." Marcus stared at the device, understanding flooding through him. This wasn't just about his father anymore, or even about Sarah's husband. This was about decades of crimes, countless victims, and a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, 2 survivors prepared for a battle that had been 30 years in the making. The wind had finally died to a whisper, and pale morning light filtered through the cabin's frost-covered windows. Marcus sat at the edge of the bed where Sarah lay sleeping, her breathing steady and peaceful for the first time since he'd found her. The baby, his nephew, slept curled against her chest, tiny fingers wrapped around her thumb. He stared at the photograph in his hands, the edges worn soft from years of handling. 23 years of believing his sister was dead, and here was her daughter, carrying on a bloodline he thought had ended with Rebecca's supposed overdose. The lies his father had built their family on felt heavier than the snow that had nearly buried them all. Sarah stirred, her eyes opening slowly. When she saw him watching her, she didn't flinch anymore. The terror that had consumed her for days had finally ebbed. "How long was I asleep?" she whispered, careful not to wake the baby. "About 6 hours. The storms passed." Marcus set the photograph on the nightstand, Rebecca's senior portrait, the one their father had hidden away with all the other evidence of her existence. The road should be clear enough now. She nodded, then looked at him with those eyes that were so much like his sister's. It still took his breath away. What happens now? Marcus had been asking himself the same question all night. Detective Chen had radioed 3 hours ago to confirm that Vincent Castellano and his remaining men were in custody. The crime scene at the Castellano estate had yielded enough evidence to put Vincent away for life, even without Sarah's testimony. But she would testify anyway. She'd made that clear. "Now you get to live," he said simply. "You and Thomas, both." Sarah's smile was tentative but real. Thomas? Your mother wanted to name her first son Thomas. She told me that when we were kids. The memory came back to him clearly now, one of hundreds that their father's manipulation had tried to bury. She said she'd name him after our grandfather. Tears gathered in Sarah's eyes. She never told me that story. There are a lot of stories she never got to tell you. Marcus reached for her hand. But I can tell them now if you want. I remember almost everything about her. The radio crackled to life, and Chen's voice filled the cabin. Marcus, you copy? We've got vehicles about 2 miles out from your location. Marcus picked up the radio. Copy that. We're ready. He'd already packed what little they had. The bag that had started this whole revelation sat by the door, no longer a source of terror but a bridge between past and present. Inside were the documents that would help Sarah build a new identity, legally this time, and the photographs that would help her understand where she came from. I'm scared, Sarah admitted, as they heard the distant rumble of engines. Of what? Of starting over. I've been running for so long I don't know how to just live. She looked down at her son, how to raise him without looking over my shoulder. Marcus understood that fear intimately. He'd spent his entire adult life in these mountains, hiding from a world that his father had taught him to distrust. But finding Sarah had changed something fundamental in him. The isolation that had once felt protective now felt like another prison. You won't be doing it alone, he said. I'm done hiding up here. This mountain was my refuge, but it doesn't have to be my prison anymore. The sound of vehicles grew closer, and Marcus could see the flash of emergency lights through the trees. Sarah clutched the baby tighter, and he saw that old panic trying to resurface. Hey, he squeezed her hand. These are the good guys. Detective Chen, the FBI agents working your case, probably a medical team to check on you and Thomas. No one's going to hurt you, she nodded, taking deep breaths. Will you stay with me? When they ask their questions, when I have to tell them everything? Every step of the way. The vehicles pulled up outside, 2 FBI SUVs and an ambulance. Marcus heard car doors slamming, voices calling out. In a moment, the quiet sanctuary of the cabin would be invaded by the machinery of justice and bureaucracy. But for now, it was still just the 3 of them. Rebecca would be proud of you, Marcus said, helping Sarah to her feet. For protecting your son, for surviving, for being willing to fight back. She was brave like that too. Sarah looked at him with those familiar eyes, and for a moment he could see his sister in her so clearly it was like Rebecca was standing right there with them. Will you tell me about her, all the stories? He opened the door to let the light in,